tonight, and happy Cinco de Mayo to you. And so tonight our topic is on, staying motivated, especially during times of heightened stress. And so my hope for you tonight is that you'll get some good reminders of things that you may already know, but also be able to perhaps walk away with some new ideas that you haven't considered. So as always, I thank you for your patience as we continue to work through the technology pieces. And feel free to put any chats or questions in the chat box at any time, because I'd like to go ahead and answer any questions that you might have as we go through the workshop. And so tonight, oops, and my chat box disappeared. You've already met my family, so we're going to go right past that. And so, as I said, our topic is motivation. We're going to talk about two different types of motivation. One that comes from the inside out, which we refer to as intrinsic motivation, and the motivation that comes from the outside in, which is extrinsic motivation. In addition to that, we'll discuss some of the barriers, things that get in the way, and how that relates to our youth, specifically kids of adolescent age. They are unique in that at the beginning of puberty, they start going through a lot of major changes, not just physically, but in terms of their brain development. And that does have an impact on their motivation. And as we go through the process tonight, of course, we're going to be talking about different solutions along the way. So different strategies and ideas. So here we go. A motivation is the reason or reasons one has for acting or behaving in a particular way. You may have participated in a webinar or a conference or read a book where the facilitator asked you the question, what is your why? Meaning, what is your motivation for pursuing this particular goal? It's important to identify that motivation or that why, because anytime we pursue a goal, we are going to run into obstacles along the way, and we're going to need to find ways to stay committed to our goal so that we can overcome whatever obstacles get in our way. When you think about a motivator, we can think about this in two ways. One is what I referred to just a minute ago when I talked about an intrinsic motivation, meaning it's something that is a passion for you. And this is the best type of motivation, because when we are intrinsically motivated to do something, we're more likely to persevere, if you will. Extrinsic motivation would be referring to something in the environment, which can also be a great motivator. When we think in terms of parenting, it could be, a kid would be motivated because they fear a punishment or a logical consequence, but it can also be in terms of a positive thing. Maybe there's a reward or something that a person is focused on that is also a motivator to them. But when we talk about motivation, think about it in coming from within the individual, but also from the environment or external factors. Now, our first poll tonight looks at our motivation within the context of the stay-at-home orders. And so I'd like to take a minute for those of you who would like to participate in our poll to talk a little bit or to identify what your motivation has been like over the past few months as we've continued to stay at home. So you have a range here from what motivation, I'm spinning my wheels, which is understandable, to my motivation is depleting with each day, to I'm steady, it really hasn't changed. Some people might be experiencing an increase in motivation, and then there might be a few people who say my motivation is at an all-time high. And so if you'd like to participate in that, you can share those responses. And so, a lot of us are in the same place where it's either about the same or, this is hard. The daily grind is getting tiring, and so it's not uncommon to feel a little bit more depleted. My point in this is that motivation is going to be on a continuum, meaning there's going to be some days where you feel more motivated than other days, and that's very natural. Your motivation is going to be influenced by things that are happening internally as well as externally. And so while we go through this workshop, we're going to dive into some of these potential barriers to motivation. Well, recognize that there's more than just these 5, but because of time, I just wanted to hone in on these a little bit more. So last week, we talked about flattening the COVID stress curve. And we learned that there's healthy levels of stress that we experience each day that help motivate us, get us focused, prioritize, and perform well. But we also learn that when we're experiencing stress over a prolonged period of time at a heightened level, there's a tendency for us to become physically fatigued, exhausted, have trouble thinking, prioritizing, problem solving, and things like that. And so that's where we might be feeling some of that fatigue that a few of us are experiencing as we completed that last poll. And that is a very common response to where things are today in living in this environment. And so it's just a recognition of where your stress level is. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just important to recognize it so you consider what you can do to get yourself back over to more of a healthy side. And so, you know, in summary here, when we look at the stress of COVID, certainly that prolonged time frame of uncertainty, isolation, not having control is going to influence your stress response to be in a more heightened state of arousal because of that. And so fortunately, there's things that we can do about that, like I said, to get us back into more of a healthy mode. And those are some of the things that we've talked about before, but that we're also going to review. And so here is our second poll for this evening. In the past, we talked about different stress management strategies that you can experiment with, because the key is that each individual responds to stress differently. And so likewise, what is helpful to you in reducing your stress level may not be as helpful to another person. So when you're developing your stress management plan, it's important to experiment with different strategies to find out what truly gives you some relief. And so here are your strategies here. And if you'd like to, you can post, or excuse me, you can click on all of the strategies that you've been trying, specifically those that you're finding are starting to provide some relief to you. And so we'll give that some time. So maybe it's activity or movement, just getting outdoors. Maybe you're making those connections with people, being very mindful of not isolating. We know always the importance of eating healthy foods. And so here we go. We have a few, making those connections with other people is critical. And of course, maintaining some type of schedule. So that's wonderful. And so I just encourage you, as you look at, these additional suggestions, my challenge or encouragement to you is, first of all, pat yourself on the back. Those are great choices. And could you consider incorporating another strategy so that you're building your resources up? And so consider which one you would like to experiment with next, while also maintaining the things that you're already doing, because these are very positive approaches. Okay, so I didn't submit my response in time. I checked all of them. Awesome, William. I love it. Yeah, I mean, this is important. And the one that I think that I just want to stress, they're all important, but self-compassion, just being realistic with yourself and giving yourself grace, but also compassion for others. And we're going to get further into that as we continue through our discussion. So let's move on to our next piece of a potential barrier to motivation. When you think about the situation that we're in, people are experiencing loss in many different forms, all right? Some examples of the loss that we experience, not just now, but just throughout our life would be, for example, the death of a loved one, falling in love for the first time, and having that relationship come to an end is very devastating. There's certainly a process of healing that comes with that. Perhaps you can relate in terms of maybe you lost a job, you were furloughed or let go, or your job duties changed. These are all different examples of loss. Some of them we might look at more as a negative impact, where even losses that many would consider positive, like a life stage transition where we're welcoming a new baby, is also stressful, because we are having to adjust our adult life to welcome a newborn, which is now really going to rule our life. All right. We might be excited about our college growing up and being ready, our child ready to go and move out and go to college. But at the same time, that's sad. It's a transition. And so one way of looking at this and dealing with that is just to recognize the different, losses that people are experiencing right now that you might be experiencing. As related to your children and parenting, we can think about some of the milestones that kids are not able to participate in right now. Some of the big ones might be graduating from high school, the senior prom and things like that. And so that's hard. And those types of losses, like any loss, need to be acknowledged. All right. And so recognize that when we experience a loss or a shift, of any kind, that will trigger an emotional response, which we refer to as grief. And so if you look at the literature on the different stages of grief, there's certain things that we can expect to experience when going through that process. And so the first one, to think about, the first step is that numbness or that disbelief. Is this really happening? It feels very surreal. And this sense of numbness actually serves is thought to serve a protective function, as people, settle into that new reality. I remember years ago attending for a funeral for a family who had lost a 10-year-old to a terrible accident. And, and I was just in awe at how they were able to stand there and greet people, as we were going and showing our respects. And I think there was that protective, just that numbness that helped them through that initial week or two as they were experiencing that incredible loss. Typically, as we are kind of moving through the process, a person will experience a sense of denial, a sense of accepting that new reality is hard to do. And oftentimes anger follows, anger at the world, anger at anyone in their environment. We kind of see some of that, why me, why not someone else? If a person of faith might be angry at God or other spiritual leaders. And so anger is often a part of that grief process. So a teenager lashing out about, why couldn't this happen at another time? This isn't fair. That's a very healthy emotional response to the grief that they're having. Then we move into the reality of we're moving towards acceptance. And so this loss is settling in. And oftentimes people find themselves feeling very sad, a little bit depressed as the reality of the situation is there. And then moving into that acceptance piece where we, acknowledge, okay, this is where things are at. And now we're recalibrating, if you will, to a new sense of being, of relating, to that situation, etc. Now, there's a gentleman by the name of David Kessler that has added a 6th stage to the grief process, which makes a great deal of sense, and that is finding meaning. And so oftentimes after we've suffered some type of loss or incredibly challenging situation, we'll look back on that situation and people will say, okay, now I can see how that situation helped to form who I am right now. You know, I can see the purpose in it as it relates to me and who I am moving forward. And that's a very healthy place to get in time. But the key with the stages of grief is to recognize that everybody goes through the process differently. And so while I'm showing arrows like this, people might go from being numb to being angry to being depressed to denial. You know, people tend to move all over through that process. And so it's important to know that there's not one right way to grieve, but that for everyone, it's an individual process. And when you look at, you know, because of the social distancing, if you are related to or friends with someone who has passed away during this process and could not, you know, attend a funeral, you know, because of social distancing, then things get a little bit more complicated, and we call that complicated grief. And so in order to help that person heal in that family, there has to be some type of ritual to help move them through that process. But it's just important to know that it is a process, and we go through it many times throughout our life. And it's not a process that can be rushed. It's just a process that we experience and move through at our own pace. So, you know, in summary, basically when we look at, for those of you who like a checklist, it's getting to that point of, you know, the acceptance that this is the new reality, taking time to work through the pain of whatever that loss was, adjusting to a new environment or a way of relating, seeing things, and then emotionally relocating, getting back to, okay, where do I go from here? And so that's just essentially the process. And there's things that we can do to help people. But first, people often ask me, well, you know, how do I know if this person is going through the grief process in a healthy way? You know, it seems like it's just taking forever, or they're just so stuck. And it's really hard to tell because people are so different in how they grieve. And so, you know, to look at the differences here, one way to determine some differences is, you know, is a person feeling blue, or are they actually depressed? All right. And I'd like you to look at this in the context of our kids who have lost certain social connections, certain milestone celebrations, and things like that. So as you look at that, think about that context. When we think about the blues, typically it's tied to a specific situation. So not being able to have friends over to celebrate a birthday party, person might be feeling kind of sad about that. But it doesn't encompass all areas of the person's life. In fact, even though they weren't able to celebrate that, they can still experience joy in other areas. And so they might participate in different connections with their peers, you know, through Zoom calls and things like that, and still experience joy. The other thing that we find is that people who are just feeling blue tend to respond to support from other people. And we know that that healing happens over time. Those feelings start to dissipate over time. You know, an example of this would be, you know, a sports team losing some, you know, big competition that we worked so hard for. And so naturally we're feeling, you know, really sad about that. But over time, we regroup, we replan, or we get ready for the next season. Whereas depression is much different. because it's actually a mood disorder that lasts for a period of at least 2 weeks. And it affects a person's whole person, making it difficult for them to just carry out the functions of everyday life, getting up, taking a shower, brushing the teeth, changing clothes, eating, things like that. It impacts a person's physically as well as emotionally, cognitively. We find that people who are dealing with depression have a lot of somatic complaints, headaches, muscle tension, digestive issues might be seen. Not everyone who is depressed experiences that, but many people do. We find that people who are experiencing depression have a hard time focusing and making decisions. The thought processes are pretty negative in terms of feeling a lack of agency, lack of control. Things are never going to change. These things always happen to me. And we often see that isolation where a person is no longer reaching out to friends and loved ones. And so that's more serious. And that's a situation where when we're seeing those types of behaviors, that's where we would want to reach out to, a mental health professional to get some feedback and tips on how to help this person. And we'll have some connections for you at the end of the workshop, as always, on how to do that. But if we're dealing with more of the blues and dealing with, this type of different types of losses related to the COVID, I always start with empathy. We always we need more empathy in our world, people being able to step outside of their own experience and put themselves in the shoes of another person and imagine, gosh, what would it be like to be experiencing, that loss that you're experiencing, not being able to have your senior prom, for example. And we want to then provide ourselves as a safe space for that person, meaning I'm just here to listen to you. I'm a safe place that you can vent your feelings, whatever they are, and I'm not going to judge you for that. I'm not going to tell you that you're overreacting or you're being overly dramatic. I'm not going to say to you, well, think of all the other people and what they've lost. At least we have I have my job still, we have a home, we can eat. That's, might be true, but it's not very helpful. And so just accepting someone where they're at and listening to that oftentimes releases a person to be able to step out of that sad, place and to start thinking about the future and what can we do about this. And so that's a practice that is very hard to do, especially with our kids, because I think as parents, we have a tendency to want to step in and fix the problem for them, which we cannot always do, and it's not always best to do that. We might be able to provide suggestions by asking, how can I help? But the key there is that sometimes people don't know what they need. And so you might just let the person know, I'm here to listen whenever you need to vent or talk. If you come up with some ideas and there's things that I can help with, please let me know. But if you say, you know what, we're going to do something about this, and you make a commitment, it's critical that you follow through with whatever that commitment is. When talking specifically, when I've done workshops dealing with the loss of a loved one, what people have said when I ask them what is most helpful from other people, they always say, don't say, give me a call if I can help you, because most people say they won't do that. But instead, think about something specific that you can do and just follow through in doing it. Don't be afraid to pick up the phone for fear of saying the wrong thing. Just letting that person know, hey, I love you, I care about you, I'm here for you, I'm here to listen, is wonderfully and helpful. one participant in a workshop once said that she offered to bring plastic forks, spoons, and all the plates and stuff to the visitation afterwards. And the wife who had lost her husband was just very grateful for something as small as that. Okay, so it doesn't have to be huge. It's just letting a person know, hey, I really care. All right. So if we look at this, how to support others, I've been noticing some really fun ways that people are becoming creative and celebrating milestones. This actually was my own birthday, where friends of mine basically planned a parade to celebrate from a safe distance, my birthday. And that was a lot of fun to stand in the yard and just have people come by. And I'm just curious of other things that you might have noticed as you're out in the community in terms of things that other people are doing to celebrate, in a safe way. Oh, I'm needing to go backwards. There we go. I know with the high school seniors, I'm starting to see some signs go up in yards that say congratulations, graduate, whether that's Lee Summit High School or our Lee Summit North or West families. I imagine other communities are doing that. I cannot see the chat box, so if there's anything else being written, I'm going to rely on Rachel to let me know. Let's see here.
I just mentioned that I've seen lots of cool yard signs, like the happy birthday signs and the thanks for our responder signs in our around town. And then our neighborhood, I know we're hosting a parade on Friday for the seniors who are graduating. They're going to be the parade, and everyone's planning on leaving their houses and going out and waving to them. And we got a cupcake truck delivering cupcakes for the seniors. So I thought that was kind of neat. And I heard that the schools are also lighting up the stadiums for the seniors too. So,
oh man,
few different celebrations there.
Yeah, that's so cool. I mean, I think of them, being in their cars going through that parade and, just feeling that love from their community, so it's not your traditional graduation ceremony, but talk about silver linings, having a whole community support you in that way. Neat. That is so neat. And it is neat to see the signs out in front of hospitals and people's residents celebrating things like you mentioned with the birthdays. It's cool to see that stuff on Facebook. People are amazing. So think about that, in terms of, can we still celebrate those milestones? There's just a lot of ideas out there. So if you're dealing with a kiddo in your home, that's feeling that loss, going through that grief. These are some things that we could do to maybe take the edge off. But in the end, as they get through this challenging time, just being able to see that, yeah, I got through this and I made it, and it's going to make them, strong, that new meeting in the end. They won't appreciate that right now, though, let's be honest. So another potential barrier, for those of you who have adolescents, is motivation at risk with kids of adolescent age? And I had mentioned how once a kid starts going through puberty, and for girls that could be as young as 10, boys typically 11, 12, that their body and their mind or their brain starts going through some tremendously dramatic changes. And these changes definitely are going to have an impact on their behavior, which would affect their motivation. And so I bullet pointed some of these things for you to keep in mind as you reflect on just your adolescent's behavior, if you have one or will have one soon, even non-related to COVID and what we're going through right now. So I think I'm going to need to go back. Nope. Okay, social connections are important during adolescence. True or false? The question is, youth require a different amount of social connection. Actually, that is true, which you probably have guessed already. And we know that what I mean by require a different amount of social connection is that some youth require more social connection than others. And so if you have a youth who's more introverted, that child might not be too upset socially about, having to stay at home and not do all of the, face-to-face social stuff, because that might be more exhausting to them. Whereas a kid who is very accustomed to being out there and likes to be out and socialize, this is going to be more difficult for them, as we know. And so we know we need to understand that each of our individual kids has a different level of need in that area. And so we can look at ways to help them, stay connected. Another one, adolescent goes to their peers for acceptance and approval. True or false? Youth do not listen to their parents. False. Even though they might be acting like they don't listen to you, they actually are listening to you. And so a lot of research shows, in relationships to substance use and other things, that parents have the biggest impact on their kids' behavior. And so while we might think that they're not listening because perhaps they're rolling their eyes or whatever that behavior it is, you do need to know that they are listening, even though their peers are taking up more space in terms of who they're turning to for acceptance and approval. Here's one. During adolescence, youth exert their independence. True or false? It is common for youth to test limits, act contentiously, and share less. Yep. And so if you once had a puppy living in your house that was just excited to greet you and tell you every minute detail about their day, and then one morning you woke up with a cat, that is a very appropriate analogy in considering what happens as adolescents go through the process of becoming more independent. They become more self-focused, and so sometimes we refer to them as being selfish, and they are trying to figure out what they can get away with. Where are the limits? Where are the boundaries? And that is a very normal, healthy place. We expect our teenagers, to go through that process, but we also know as a parent that we need to take care of ourselves and establish limits and expectations that we can enforce while they do so. Now, I'm a little puzzled here because this was the second of two slides, and I'm not seeing my, okay, so these just got shifted around for some reason. But here's the other one. The brain is not fully developed until about age 25. True or false? Teens think like adults. The answer to that one is false. And so even though your son or daughter may look like a fully formed adult, if you will, which many of them have reached physical maturation by 15 years, some younger, they do not think like adults. And so it's important that we understand that they don't think and process the world the same way we do. The reason for that is because the brain develops from the back to the front. And so ironically, the frontal cortex, which is the part that's responsible for planning, problem solving, and impulse control, actually develops last. That's why if you go to rent a car, you cannot rent a car until age 25 because the car rental agencies have done all the analytics on this and they know what the risk factors are, and that is why they don't rent to younger people. So they're way ahead on the brain science here. So here's this one you can probably pick out pretty easily. True or false, teens naturally think through consequences before they act. The key word is naturally, and the answer is false. That is something that we have to develop by allowing our kids to experience the logical consequences of their actions. That's why I always stress that when we interfere with that process by rescuing them from poor decisions or solving problems for them, they don't think about consequences correctly. They get a distorted view of cause and effect. And so it's important for us to allow them to learn from the mistakes that they make, especially while they're still living within the safety of our home. When they get out on their own, we know that those consequences to their actions start to carry a much higher price tag. So let's make mistakes, let them live with the consequences as much as we can while they're home and while they're younger. All right, here's two more. The amygdala, known as the pleasure reward center of the brain, is fully developed by age 15, right? So true or false, by age 15, the brain is drawn to more pleasurable activities or activities that are considered more fun to do. I don't know if I really wrote that very well, but the answer is true. And so because of how the brain has developed by that age, the child or the adolescent is going to be drawn more towards playing video games or getting on social media or things that are just fun rather than things that they need to do as far as responsibilities, which could be online school or helping out with their chores and things like that. And that's why I tell parents that during this time, our role is to be the frontal cortex until our child fully develops that part of the brain. And to do that, we gently direct them back to their responsibilities. And so we might say, you know what, you're welcome to play those video games for a while as soon as you finish your chores or finish your math homework or whatever it is that they need to get done. They're not going to appreciate this. And that's when they start to argue, that's where we need to say, I love you too much to argue, and remove ourselves from the situation. Finally, I talked about this one earlier. Social connections are important, and it's just important to know that there's no right or wrong amount of social connection that people need. People need different types of connection depending on their personality. And so we just need to be mindful of that. And especially when we're all, hunkering down in one place, to be able to provide some privacy, time away from the family as well as time with the family, having a good combination there. So why did I put all this stuff on here in relation to motivation? And the reason why is because we know that teenagers are more vulnerable, or adolescents, because their brain doesn't think like an adult brain and they have fewer coping mechanisms than we do. And so we need to keep in mind that as we look at their behavior, it's not that they're being lazy or that there's not a sense of responsibility or organization. It's really a lot of how their brain is functioning and engineered at this point in our life. And so how can we help them to develop that frontal cortex thinking, if you will, where they stop and think about, consequences and learn how to manage their time. And a lot of that is just done through modeling, modeling as well as, working with them to establish a schedule and to stay on schedule when their amygdala brings them more towards those pleasurable activities. So what do we do? So as we wrap up, I'm going to bring us back to that 5-step problem-solving guide that we've talked about. And this is coming from the standpoint of being in a role of a consultant to our kid rather than being a helicopter or a drill sergeant parent. So to review, when there's a problem, we always want to start with empathy. And then we're going to hand the problem back to the child or teen by asking a question. What are you going to do? And then if they are stumped or don't or just aren't sure what to do, we can ask, would you like to hear what others are doing? And finally, as we consider different options for addressing that situation, we need to think about, well, what might the consequences be? But finally, we want to communicate to the kid, I believe in you. You know, you got this. Go give it a try. Let me know how it works out. So this is how our kids are starting to develop that problem-solving muscle. And we want to start this process as young as possible. If I had more time, I have a great 3-year-old story I could tell you on how I use this, but we're going to keep moving on. So here's our problem. I brought these up based on information that I received previously. Online school. You know, not all kids are adapting well to online school. You know, some kids are really hating it. You know, they want that interaction and that's their way of learning. All right. And so we start with empathy. It sounds like you're frustrated with online school, right? How do you plan to get through the next few weeks, right? How are you going to get over the finish line? Then, would you like to hear what other kids are doing? And here are some ideas. Remember, I said start with a bad one so they have a sense of control over the situation and so they could start thinking through the consequences. Well, you know, some kids decide just to give it 50% effort and, you know, see how that works out. What do you think of that? Right? And some kids might say, yeah, that's fine. That's what I'm doing. You know, that's not ideal, right? Where others might say, well, you know, I really want to get a good grade in this class and, you know, so forth and so much. And so we can move on. Some kids decide to reach out to their teacher for help. All right. And so now we're starting to teach some of those soft skills, life skills, things that they can do on their own, you know, as they get older. We need to reach out for help. It might not be school. It could be something else. And you can plug this in with any other ideas. Knowing your kid, you can help be that frontal cortex so that they can then pick and choose which ones they want to try out. And then finally, we're going to say, all right, you know, go for it. You got this. Let me know how it turns out. All right. Another example might just be motivation in general, you know, where a kid kind of gets stuck, and we all do at times, where we're like, I can't do it. And we're thinking of all the reasons why we can't do it or why we don't want to do it, right? And so first we want to normalize that feeling again with empathy. You sound overwhelmed or you sound frustrated. Then the next question again is, what are you going to do? Okay, so we're getting the kid by asking the question to start thinking about it. And kids don't like to think because it's a lot of work. Sometimes they just want that problem to be solved for them, which I understand. Sometimes it's helpful to ask, what have you tried? So that you can get a sense of what the kid has already done to address the issue. And you might find, my goodness, this kid's already done a lot. You know, it's not like they're just blowing this thing off. They've been trying. So that way you have more information. Then, of course, we can go to, would you like to hear what other kids are doing? And here's an opportunity for you if you'd like. You know, if our topic is motivation and your kid is not feeling very motivated, here's an opportunity for you to think about some of the things that you've done in your own home to help with motivation ideas. And you could go ahead and put those in the chat box. And then we can look at those and see what other ideas. The key is you don't have to have a ton of ideas to get the kid thinking about solutions. And of course, every kid is a little bit different. You know, based on age, we might be looking at our solutions a little bit differently. So Rachel, do we have any ideas on how to motivate or suggestions for motivation?
No comments at this point.
No comments at this time. Okay. So when we're not feeling motivated, we might say, well, you know, some kids need to just jump in and do the hard stuff first. You know, we think about our peak performance times, and for some people, doing the hard stuff first helps. For other kids, we need to think about maybe our expectations. You know, we had certain expectations, so maybe we need to adjust our expectations based on our new situation. Some kids decide to get started with the first step, which is your how do you eat an elephant analogy, one bite at a time. And then they reward themselves with some type of break along the way. I do that all the time. You know, I need to get one project done and then I'm out in my yard doing something that I love to do. And so thinking about also things that you do yourself to stay motivated are very helpful things to pass on to your children as well.
We did have a few suggestions come in.
Oh, good. Go ahead.
Yeah. William suggested maybe learning a new chore like mowing. And Gina suggested taking the kids for a walk or a scooter ride if they did what they were told.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, I love that, you know, building in those incentives and thinking about what is it that the kids want to do. You know, another one, you know, is providing choices. You know, especially, you know, with our younger kids, you know, the idea is that you are going to do your homework, but where would you like to start? Would you rather do your math homework first, or should we do a little bit of reading first? You know, just giving those options. Would you rather take a shower first or a bath? Would you rather go to the park or play with sidewalk chalk out in the yard? You know, just thinking about all those different choices that they can provide, which when we feel we have a sense of control, we're more at ease and have an easier time jumping in and doing things. So certainly keep that in mind. These are things that we talked about previously. And so the reason why I brought this up again is because it's a good reminder of things that we can do on a regular basis to manage our stress. And we did that poll earlier. So I'd like you to continue to think about that. But I also want us to finish thinking about the concept of control. And so I found this quote today: incredible change happens in your life when you decide to take control of what you do have power over instead of craving control over what you don't. All right. The only person in the whole wide world that we can control is ourselves. And there's a lot of things in our life, obviously, that will happen that we have zero control over, but we need to focus on, here's the situation, where should I put my energy? And that's where we find our relief and our motivation, rather than focusing on things that we really have no control over. And so I want you to just think about that. You know, where are you centering your intention? Where is your mind wandering? Where are you putting all your brain energy? Is it into things that you really have no control over? You know, is your brain spinning with the what ifs and the fears and things like that? Or are you focusing on your brain on the things that you do have control over? You know, such as making plans, having that schedule, taking care of yourself. Just something to reflect on. And so that is where I'm going to end us for this evening. These are also some different resources to help with the mental health side of things. And Lisa McCares also has an e-newsletter. And so we want to make sure that you are aware of that and can get signed up for that. And you can do that by emailing me, or maybe even through the comments section on your, survey that comes out after this workshop. You could say, sign me up for the e-news, because that's where you're going to find out about upcoming workshops and other things. But here's our plan so far. We are going to take a week away from the workshops and would like to get some input during that time on what is valuable to you in terms of future topics. Would also encourage you, if you haven't listened to the previous seminars, to go back and maybe listen to some of those. You might have some questions that come up. But does anyone have any questions about the topic that we discussed tonight before we wrap off for the evening?
I don't see any questions, no hands popping up.
Okay.
Have a quiet group tonight.
We do. We have a smaller group tonight. The motivation, I don't know. Bio, do you think? But
Cinco de Mayo is a demotivator.
a demotivator, but that's because you folks are here. And I'm glad that you're here. And I'm hopeful that there was something that was mentioned in tonight's workshop that you'll find helpful to you. And please do let us know what you would like to discuss as we move forward. So that's all I have.
All right. Thanks so much. And we'll see you all soon.
Awesome.